They called her broken. That was the first word my son chose when he stood on my porch 24 years ago. His hand clenched around the elbow of a 4-year-old girl who wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't lift her chin, wouldn't even shift her weight without first glancing at his shoes, as if the ground itself needed permission. "She's broken, Mom. I can't do this. You'll know what to do." He said it the way other men say, "trash day," or "the car won't start." An inconvenience, not a child. I remember the way the late autumn air stung my cheeks, sharper than usual, because I had just opened the door expecting a visit, a coffee, a story about his week, anything except a daughter he didn't know how to love. And I remember thinking, in one disoriented second, that maybe he was joking. Maybe this was one of those awkward attempts at humor he still tried when he wanted to sound casual. But his eyes were flat, his shoulders sagging in that familiar, cowardly slope that appears whenever he's about to run from something he doesn't understand. The girl, my granddaughter, though I didn't know her well enough to claim that word yet, held an old stuffed bear that looked chewed on the edges and smelled faintly of detergent. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply existed there, in the small rectangle of light spilling from my doorway, like a puzzle piece some careless hand had dropped in the wrong box. I was 64 then. I lived alone. I thought my years of raising children, soothing fevers, balancing bills, and teaching myself to endure disappointment with quiet grace were finished. I thought I'd finally reached the chapter of life where mornings were slow, days were mine, and no one leaned on me so hard I forgot what standing straight felt like. But life, I've learned, doesn't knock before it rearranges the furniture. It just steps inside and shifts everything 2 inches to the left, so nothing quite fits where it used to. And that evening, as my son placed his daughter inside my home without setting down her small backpack, without removing her coat, without kneeling to explain anything to her, I felt something shift. First painfully, then irrevocably. He said he'd be in touch, though he looked away as he said it, staring somewhere over my shoulder, as if already walking down the steps in his mind. I knew that tone. I knew that distance. Parents know the small cowardices of their children long before the children know them in themselves. I wanted to ask him 1,000 questions. What happened? Why now? Where is her mother? What do you mean, broken? But I saw he was already halfway turned toward the door, and my granddaughter, barely 4, stood so still she might have been carved from one long moment of fear. So I knelt instead. My knees ached, they always had since my 40s, but I forced them down to the floor because she needed someone at her height, someone whose presence didn't tower like a storm. She glanced at me once, fast, like a bird flicking its wings, and then tucked her face into her bear's matted fur. I whispered, "You're safe here, sweetheart." Though I didn't yet know if I could promise that. Safety isn't just about walls and locks. It's about choosing to stay when running would be easier. That night, I chose to stay. My son didn't linger. He didn't hug her. He didn't even brush her hair out of her face the way parents do instinctively. He simply put the car keys back into his pocket, muttered something about needing space to get his life together, and left with the kind of speed that belongs to men who believe departure is a form of problem-solving. I watched his car roll down my street, the red glow of brake lights shrinking into the dark like 2 small accusations. I stood in my doorway far too long after he turned the corner, feeling the cold creep up my sleeves. The girl, my girl now, stood beside me, silent, observing the empty space he left behind as though she'd expected it all along. Inside, the house felt too large. Every clock ticked louder than usual. The floorboards seemed to exhale under our steps. I made her a small bed on the couch because I didn't know yet if she preferred darkness or a nightlight, quiet or soft noise, closeness or distance. Children like her, sensitive, watchful, processing the world at a different angle, move through life like the rest of us walk across thin ice. You learn to step lightly so the surface doesn't crack. She watched each movement as I set the blanket just so, her eyes tracking my hands with the wary precision of someone who's been startled too many times. When she finally curled up, knees tucked to her chest, and closed her eyes without a single word, I sat beside her, unsure what to do with all the feelings rising in me. Anger, yes, of course. But beneath that, a grief I didn't yet have the language for. Because there is a special kind of heartbreak reserved for mothers whose grown children break something they never bothered to see, something they expect you to fix, as if love were repairable with thread and needles. I stayed awake long after she fell asleep. I watched her small breaths, uneven, catching at the edges like her lungs were learning to trust the air. I turned off the TV. I ignored every impulse to call my son. I didn't want to hear him justify, rationalize, minimize. I didn't want excuses wrapped in platitudes. Instead, I whispered into the dim room, "You're not broken." She didn't hear me then, but I needed to say it. I needed to hear it. And I think, somewhere in the quiet of that first night, the universe leaned in just a little, as if to acknowledge that everything had changed, and nothing, not her life, not mine, not the fragile, aching space between us, would ever be the same again. When the morning finally came, thin and gray and slow to warm the frost on my windows, I realized that the previous night had not been a momentary lapse in judgment on my son's part, but the beginning of something far heavier. Something that would settle into the foundation of my life before I even understood the shape of it. I woke to the sound of quiet shuffling in the living room and found the girl sitting on the floor, her legs folded underneath her, her bare pressed to her face like a shield. She wasn't crying. Children who have learned not to be heard rarely waste tears in other people's homes. She was simply sitting, motionless, absorbing the silence around her as if trying to predict its conditions. I took in the details. The way she rocked almost imperceptibly, her small fingers tapping the bear's paw in steady patterns. The faint, bruised shadows under her eyes that no 4-year-old should ever wear. My heart squeezed in that deep, aching way it does only when you recognize pain before you recognize the person carrying it. I made oatmeal because it felt gentle, and I put honey in it because sweetness can sometimes soften a morning. She didn't come to the table when I called. She didn't move at all. So I sat across from her on the carpet, placed the bowl near her knees, and waited. Not pushed, not coaxed. Waited. Eventually, she lifted her eyes, the smallest flicker of a glance, and then her hands reached, cautious and mechanical, as if she expected the bowl to disappear before she touched it. She ate in tiny, deliberate bites, her gaze drifting between the spoon and the floor. I could see her trying to disappear into herself. I knew that posture intimately. I'd worn it too many times when life demanded compliance instead of voice. Around 10 that morning, my son finally called. His voice was strained, brittle, carrying the hollow ring of someone rehearsing the version of events that would make him sound responsible. He said he needed a little time to stabilize things and figure out next steps, which was his way of saying he was overwhelmed but not overwhelmed enough to face it head on. Then he told me the girl had been evaluated for behavioral issues, though he spoke with the casualness of someone listing items from a grocery list. He said the word autistic, like a label printed on a defective appliance, an inconvenience he'd been saddled with. I felt a quiet heat rise from my stomach to my chest. Anger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums low like an approaching storm. I wanted to ask him when exactly he had planned to tell me any of this, but I knew he would dodge the question, cloak it in misplaced guilt or logistical excuses. So instead, I told him she was safe, and he let out a sigh of relief so disproportionate to the reality of the situation that I had to sit down. It was the sound of a man who had put down a burden he didn't believe was his to carry. He said he'd check in soon, then hung up before I could respond. That week blurred into routines I didn't yet know I was creating. I ventured into the delicate dance of understanding her world. What startled her, what soothed her, what made her fold in on herself like a wilting flower. She didn't speak, not even a whisper, but she watched me constantly. Her eyes followed my hands when I cooked, my feet when I walked across the room, my breath when I sat beside her on the couch. There was a depth in her gaze that unsettled me, not because it suggested something broken, but because it held a wisdom far too old for someone so small. Children who grow up inside quiet wounds often develop that look. It's the face of a soul that learned to survive before it learned to play. The catalyst came not in the moment he left her on my porch, but 3 days later when I received a voicemail from her mother. A cold, clipped message in a stranger's voice saying that she had no capacity to deal with the situation and that everyone agrees the child is better off with someone who has patience. The words were sterile, chosen with the kind of emotional distancing that comes from long practice. I listened to it twice, then a third time, hoping I had misheard, hoping the cruelty was accidental. But it wasn't. Her mother wasn't calling to discuss or plan or check on her daughter. She was calling to remove herself from any future responsibility. It was abandonment disguised as practicality, and it made something inside me lock into place with a finality I could feel in my bones. I walked back into the living room where the girl sat on the floor with her bear. She looked up as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. I lowered myself onto the carpet, my knees protesting the movement, and I reached out my hand, not to touch her, not to pull her closer, just to show her it was there. She didn't take it. She didn't need to. What mattered was the offering. What mattered was that someone, for the first time in her life perhaps, was extending a hand without expecting her to perform gratitude or compliance in return. That evening, as she fell asleep on the couch, her breath steady and soft, I sat in the dim light of the lamp and listened to the quiet house. And that's when it truly hit me, an understanding so sharp and so plain it cut through all denial. Neither of her parents would be coming back for her. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when things stabilized, not when guilt visited them in the middle of the night. I realized that this wasn't a temporary arrangement or a favor a mother does for her struggling son. This was a surrender. The kind adults make when they believe someone else is more capable of loving the child they have failed to understand. And in that moment, something inside me, something old, something fierce, something I thought had retired decades earlier, rose up with a quiet certainty. I knew the weight that was settling onto my shoulders. I knew the years it would cost, the The sleepless nights, the loneliness, the financial strain, the heartbreak of watching her navigate a world not built for her. But I also knew that she had been left on my doorstep because she was unwanted everywhere else, and children like her don't just need help. They need someone to choose them. Not out of obligation, out of love deep enough to remake the shape of a life. The catalyst wasn't their abandonment. It was my decision, made silently in that warm, lamplit room, that I would not abandon her, no matter how easy it might have been to let someone else step in, that I would take this small, fragile, brilliant child into my life and hold her steady until she learned the world wouldn't always disappear on her. That I would become again the kind of woman I had once been for her father. Only this time, I would not allow my love to be taken for granted, erased, or rewritten by those too weak to name their failures. That was the moment the story truly began, though I didn't know then how far it would take us, or how much it would cost, or how profoundly it would reshape the two of us. All I knew was that she was here, asleep on my couch, breathing into the hollow her parents had left behind, and that I, for reasons that felt older than memory, was ready to fill it. The first signs that things were beginning to tighten around both of us came quietly, almost politely, like unwelcome guests who slip into a house without making the floorboards creak. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No confrontation, no phone call that split my life into before and after. It was the accumulation of small, persistent realities that shaped the months to come, and each one left its mark like shallow fingerprints pressed into soft clay. My granddaughter settled into routines with the same delicate caution she used for everything, walking through my home as though she believed each step needed permission. And in those early months, she clung to silent rituals, tapping the same corner of the table before sitting, smoothing the blanket before sleeping, lining up her crayons in one precise order that she could not explain but fiercely protected. I learned her world slowly, without manuals or guidance, discovering that surprises terrified her. Loud appliances sent her into trembling stillness, and unexpected visitors, mostly well-meaning neighbors, made her vanish into the folds of my skirt, like a startled kitten. All the while, my son's absence grew heavier, not simply because he didn't come, but because he didn't even pretend he might. At first, he sent short texts that read like corporate memos, full of vague promises about trying to sort things out, followed by nothing but silence for days or weeks at a time. He never asked about her progress, never wondered aloud what she liked to eat, never once said the word daughter with any real sense of ownership or tenderness. Eventually, the messages thinned into single sentences, practical in tone and devoid of warmth, until even those disappeared, and the only evidence that he still existed in the world came from those rare moments when I would catch myself expecting the phone to ring. Bills began stacking subtly, like sediment, and I found myself stretching grocery lists into thinner and thinner shapes. My pension could manage one person comfortably, but two, especially a child with growing needs, turned into a puzzle with too few pieces. I began sewing patches into her leggings, cutting my pills in half so prescriptions would last longer, learning which stores discounted fruit in the evening. I told myself these were logistical adjustments, nothing more. And part of me even found comfort in the return to purpose, the way a gardener finds solace in pruning old branches. But a different part of me, one that I hadn't heard from in years, whispered in the evenings, asking whether I was disappearing again, whether I was once more becoming the quiet support beam that everyone depended on until it splintered from weight. That whisper grew louder each time someone assumed she was merely visiting, and I found myself crafting explanations that tripped in my throat because I hadn't yet accepted the truth in full. She was mine to raise now, not officially, not legally, but emotionally, spiritually, and practically. She depended on me the way a vine depends on a trellis. Without support, it collapses. And with support, it grows in ways no one expects. I watched her try to navigate preschool, holding her tiny backpack with both hands as though it anchored her to the ground. She struggled with transitions, clung to predictable routines like life rafts, and often came home exhausted from the noise and unpredictability of other children. I met with her teachers, who spoke with careful politeness, offering diluted concern and lists of recommended specialists that I could scarcely afford. One teacher said, "She seems very inward," as though that single sentence explained everything. And I bit back the urge to ask what she expected from a child who had been left behind by every adult meant to fight for her. Instead, I thanked her, took the pamphlets, and promised I would look into options, though I already knew that finding resources would be a long and uphill battle with no guideposts. Meanwhile, my son remained absent from parent meetings, milestones, medical forms, things he should have been signing, attending, participating in. He sent an occasional message about being busy, but I no longer wasted energy waiting for him to turn the corner from inconvenience to responsibility. The girl began to warm to me quietly, the way winter eventually yields to spring. Not in a burst of flowers, but in subtle shifts you notice only when you look closely. She started placing her bear beside my pillow each morning, as if offering companionship without daring to voice it. She began humming under her breath when I cooked, low and rhythmic sounds that seemed to soothe her. She followed me from room to room, not out of dependence but out of safety. And when I paused to tie my shoelaces, she would touch my elbow to steady me, mirroring gestures she had likely never received herself. But with this growing closeness came new tensions. She grew anxious whenever the doorbell rang, pressing herself flat against the wall, her face contorting with fear that seemed too old for her small frame. She refused to go outside if children were in the yard next door. She cried soundlessly, those wrenching, breath-caught sobs that shake the whole body whenever something in her routine shifted unexpectedly. And each of these moments etched deeper into my understanding that I was raising a child who had lived through neglect, confusion, and emotional abandonment long before she came to me. Not broken, but bruised in ways invisible to those who wouldn't take the time to see. Money grew tight in ways I didn't speak of. I skipped meals when I could, found free community programs, and learned to mend toys she tore from anxiety rather than play. I didn't tell her she was expensive or difficult or too much. I had lived through those words as a young mother, and I refused to repeat that generational cruelty. Still, some nights, I lay awake counting the cost of everything, therapy, school supplies, winter clothes, and tried not to resent a son who slept through his life while mine stretched thinner each day. The house, once quiet in a way that comforted me, now felt like it had its own heartbeat because her presence changed its rhythm. There were crayons under the table, small shoes by the door, sheets that needed washing twice a week because she didn't yet understand certain bodily signals. It was life, messy and imperfect, and I welcomed it, even on days when exhaustion tightened around my temples like a vice. I didn't confront my son. It wasn't pride or avoidance. It was the knowledge that confrontation requires an audience willing to listen, and he had never been that kind of man. He lived in curated narratives, in self-serving explanations, in the kind of emotional laziness that tempts some adults to reshape the truth into whatever absolves them of discomfort. I knew he would say he did his best, that parenting is hard, that he trusted me. Trusted me, Those words often felt like a command disguised as praise. He trusted me to fix what he broke, to stabilize what he abandoned, to raise the child he could not face. And because I had always stepped in, always filled the gaps, always softened the blows life dealt him, he believed I would do so again without question. But the escalation wasn't merely about money, silence, or responsibility. It was the slow, dawning realization that she had no other anchor in the world but me. That every meltdown, every breakthrough, every step forward or backward landed in my hands like fragile glass I could not afford to drop. It was the weight of knowing that this wasn't temporary, wasn't transitional, wasn't a phase he'd wake from. It was the understanding that she needed someone who wouldn't leave, who wouldn't dismiss her uniqueness as inconvenience, who wouldn't label her condition instead of learning her language. And as each week passed, it became painfully clear that I was the only one willing to be that person. The first escalation was not the sharp rise of conflict, but the quiet deepening of responsibility, the slow tightening of circumstance, the creeping awareness that my life had been rerouted without warning. It was the moment I realized I wasn't simply helping her survive her days. I was rebuilding her sense of safety, brick by slow brick, even as my own foundation trembled beneath the weight of everything that had been placed upon it. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was the soft, relentless turning of a wheel that would not turn back. When she turned 14, something in the rhythm of our lives shifted. Not abruptly, like a snapped branch, but slowly, as if the air itself had thickened, and the walls of our small house had begun listening more closely to the sounds we made. She had grown into a tall, quietly graceful girl with movements so precise they looked intentional even when they weren't. And she carried herself with a kind of inward focus that made people underestimate her before she even opened her mouth. She still seldom spoke, not because she couldn't, but because the world had taught her early that words often led to confusion, dismissal, or noise she didn't know how to navigate. But she had developed other languages, patterns, rhythms, a way of observing that captured details even I, with all my years of watching life from the corners, often missed. And it was around her 14th birthday that I first noticed how quickly her mind connected things, how she held formulas in her head, how she found comfort in structure, like it was a map through a world that otherwise made too many demands. One afternoon, she came home from school carrying a folder of worksheets she'd been given during math class, and I saw immediately by the smudge of graphite on her fingers and the careful handling of the papers that she'd been working on them for hours. Her teacher had written a note on top, something polite but condescending, explaining that the assignments were simplified to meet her needs. That phrase, with all its well-meaning arrogance, burned through me. I looked at the worksheets, patterns so basic she must have finished them in minutes, and I felt a sharp pang of understanding. They weren't challenging her. They weren't even trying to. They saw a label instead of a mind, a diagnosis instead of potential. It was then I realized that the quiet limitations placed around her were not simply the result of her circumstances, but of people who believed they already knew her boundaries. That night, after dinner, I sat with her at the kitchen table and opened an old box of supplies I'd nearly forgotten I owned. Inside were remnants from my brief years working at a community center before retirement. Graph paper, a scientific calculator missing the battery cover, a worn geometry textbook with brittle pages. She watched me with the wary curiosity she reserved for moments that didn't fit her predictions. When I slid the graph paper in front of her and pointed to a problem, she hesitated at first, studying my face for signs of expectation or pressure. But when she bent her head and began working, I saw something open in her, something like a door she had been knocking on quietly for years without knowing how to push. She solved the problem, then another, and another. Her pencil moved with steady certainty, her breath deepening as if her body had finally found a rhythm it recognized. The next day, I requested a meeting with her teachers. They sat across from me in a room decorated with laminated posters of multiplication tables and cheerful slogans about effort, and they spoke with the same careful detachment I had been hearing for years. They told me she was making progress in her own way, that she needed predictability, that academic enrichment might overwhelm her. They said these things with the confidence of professionals, certain they understood the shape of a girl they barely glanced at in hallways. I listened politely. Mothers are trained to do that. And then I explained with a calmness I didn't entirely feel that she needed more. Not indulgence, not pity, opportunity. I told them about the worksheets, about her speed, about her curiosity. I told them she wasn't inward by choice, but by lack of invitation. And I watched their faces shift, just slightly, as if the idea that they had misunderstood her required a rearrangement of their internal architecture. They offered resources, slowly and reluctantly, like people handing out valuable items they weren't sure I deserved. They suggested testing, additional assignments, quiet corners where she could work without interruptions. They promised to reassess their approach, though I knew promises like that were often thin bridges built between their convenience and my persistence. Still, it was something. A starting point. But the real midpoint, the quiet turning in our story, didn't happen at school or at a meeting. It happened at home, one rainy afternoon when I returned from the grocery store, to find her sitting on the living room floor with my old laptop open, the screen filled with lines of what looked like code. My immediate instinct was to ask who had shown her such things, but no one had. She had pieced it together from library books, online tutorials, and her uncanny ability to recognize patterns in places most people see only noise. She didn't look up when I entered, not out of disrespect, but because she was submerged in that deep, consuming focus that sometimes pulled her entirely out of the world for hours at a time. When she finally did glance at me, her eyes shone not with pride, but with a quiet hope that I wouldn't take this away from her. I sat beside her, my knees protesting as always, and asked her what she was doing. She pointed to the screen with the eraser end of a pencil, tracing the structure of the code, like she was showing me the outline of a cathedral she'd built herself. Then she typed a command, hit enter, and a small animation she'd created, a simple bouncing shape, began looping on the screen. It was rudimentary, but it was also beautiful in its intentionality, the product of a mind-stitching order out of symbols. I felt something inside me shift, the same way it had years ago when she first placed her bear beside my pillow. A recognition, a knowing. She wasn't simply navigating the world, she was deciphering it in ways I hadn't imagined. From that point on, I became not only her caretaker, but her advocate, her strategist, the person standing in the doorframe of her future, refusing to let anyone restrict it because of a word that had been used to excuse so much neglect. I found her programs, courses, online communities where she could learn safely. I rearranged my budget to afford new materials. I fought quietly, consistently, for her right to be challenged. And with each new skill she learned, with each tiny victory she tucked into her pockets like polished stones, the distance between who she had been told she was and who she was becoming widened into an unbridgeable gulf. Yet with growth came new vulnerabilities. The more she understood, the more she recognized how different she felt from her peers. She struggled with group assignments, melted down after unexpected schedule changes, retreated into silence when teachers spoke too quickly or classmates teased her. I held her through storms that left her trembling, whispering the same words I'd said the night she arrived. You are safe. You are not broken. You are allowed to take up space here. And slowly, through these years of tears and triumphs, we became a unit. 2 women, one old and one young, carrying each other through a world that offered neither of us easy belonging. As she approached adulthood, something in the air around us thickened again, not with the softness of a new beginning, but with the unmistakable density of a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. By the time she turned 20, she had already carved out a small corner of the world for herself. A modest job at a local tech repair shop, a collection of online certificates in programming and QA analysis, and a quiet confidence that had taken root in her posture like a late bloom, finally trusting the soil beneath it. Her routines were still essential, her boundaries still firm, and her silences still deeper than most people could understand. But she moved through life with a determination that softened the edges of her vulnerabilities. I watched her cross rooms with a kind of focused certainty that made me think of a river finding its own path, not forceful, but unstoppable. Yet with that growth came a tension I had been bracing forever since her father walked away. The world was taking notice of her, and so was the past. It began innocently enough, with her manager offering her extra hours, then asking if she would consider applying for a role that involved more complex tasks. She hesitated at first, not because she doubted her intelligence, but because she feared the unpredictable rhythms of responsibility. She liked predictability the way some people like warm blankets or quiet music, something steady to wrap around herself when the world's noise became unbearable. But she applied anyway. She prepared meticulously, reviewing every requirement, mapping out contingency plans for anything that could go wrong, rehearsing possible questions until she built a mental scaffolding strong enough to climb. When she told me she had gotten the job, she didn't smile exactly, but her eyes softened and her shoulders loosened, and that was her version of joy. Around that time, she also received a message from an old classmate inviting her to a small gathering. She showed me the message without comment, as though handing me something both fragile and foreign. I asked her gently if she wanted to go, and she stood there, arms crossed over her chest, processing the idea with the careful deliberation of someone weighing each unknown variable. Eventually, she said she would try, and I felt a quiet swell of pride. But the night of the gathering, she returned home pale and trembling, hands clenched at her sides, unable to speak for several minutes. Only after she sat in her familiar corner of the sofa, wrapped in the same blanket she'd had since adolescence, did she find the words to explain that there had been too much noise, too many shifting conversations, too many unspoken expectations. She wasn't ashamed. She was simply overwhelmed. And as I sat with her, rubbing small circles between her shoulders, I understood that progress isn't a straight line. It's a wide, looping path with setbacks woven into its very design. Meanwhile, the silence from her father had grown so complete it felt almost architectural, like a wall built carefully over many years to keep responsibility at bay. I had long since stopped expecting anything from him, but the universe has its own sense of timing, and it rarely aligns with ours. The first sign that he was nearing the edges of our lives again came not from him, but from her. A printed email she found during a routine audit at work because she had recently been shifted into a role that required her to check internal communication logs for potential compliance issues. She recognized his name instantly, not because he had been present in her life, but because she had carried that name like a scar across the years. She brought the printed email home and placed it on the table without a word, and when I saw his name, I felt something old and cold stir in my chest. He had applied for a supervisory position in her department. He did not know she worked there. I sat opposite her at the kitchen table, both of us staring at the paper as if it were a photograph of a ghost we had tried to forget. I asked her quietly how she felt, and she didn't answer right away. She tapped her fingers slowly against the wood, a steady rhythm that told me she was sorting, filtering, arranging her emotions into something she could articulate. Finally, she said, "He will not recognize me." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were shadowed by a fear she rarely named. He never looked long enough to remember. The truth of it cut deeper than I expected. Children remember everything about the people who fail them, even when those people barely remember the children. She didn't ask me what to do. She didn't need advice. She needed presence. So I stayed at the table with her until the tension in her shoulders eased, until her breathing steadied, until the printed paper no longer felt like a threat, but merely a piece of information. In the weeks that followed, she continued her work with the same diligence she had built her adult life upon. But beneath that diligence, I could sense a shift, something cautious, bracing. She checked the internal job portal more often, monitoring the status of his application the way one watches a storm track on the news, memorizing its direction, even when hoping it might veer away. For the first time in years, she became more withdrawn, closing herself off in her room for longer stretches. Her routines sharpened to near rigidity. I tried to make the house feel softer, cooking her favorite meals, opening the windows in the afternoons to let the light spill across the floor, placing fresh flowers on the table, even though I could barely justify the expense. But she lived inside her head for a while, and I knew better than to drag her out. Some transformations required darkness, solitude, and reflection. She was preparing herself, though neither of us yet knew for what. Then, without warning, my son contacted me. A short, clipped message, more a statement than a question. "Thinking of applying for jobs in your area. Might stop by. Hope you're well." I stared at the message so long the screen dimmed. He had no idea where she worked. He had no idea how close he was, by coincidence, to stepping directly into the world she had built without him. And I felt something inside me tighten. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of protective instinct I had not felt since she was small and afraid of every unfamiliar sound. I didn't respond immediately. I waited until morning, letting the weight of his words settle. Eventually, I wrote back a neutral message, careful and distant, explaining that my life was full and my days were already spoken for. I didn't mention her. I didn't mention the job. I didn't mention the email. I didn't owe him the map to her stability. When he finally arrived in the city for his interview, she knew before I told her. She had seen his name on the schedule of upcoming candidates, a system-generated document she had access to only because of her role. She didn't panic. Instead, she sat, very still, hands folded, eyes focused on some distant point in her memory. After a long silence, she said, "I do not want to leave my job." I assured her she wouldn't have to. She nodded once, as if filing my answer away like a piece of data she could rely on. Then she stood and went to her room, closing the door with a gentleness that made my chest ache. The night before his interview, she came into the living room and sat beside me on the couch. She didn't speak, but she rested her head lightly on my arm, something she hadn't done since she was 16. In that gesture, I understood everything she couldn't say. The fear of being recognized by someone who had never truly seen her. The fear of being dismissed as insignificant. The fear of having her carefully built life shaken by a man who once left her on a doorstep without looking back. I didn't tell her she was strong. She already knew that in her bones. I didn't tell her she would handle it. She was already preparing. I simply kissed the top of her head and whispered that no matter what happened, she would not be alone. The escalation reached its full height the next day, when she walked into her workplace knowing that the past was walking in behind her. She didn't watch him arrive, but others noticed him. His polished shoes, his forced smile, the faint desperation beneath his charm. She later told me she recognized his voice first, a sound she carried not in affection, but in memory. The way someone remembers a song they never liked, but heard too often. She did not approach him. She did not hide from him. She moved through her day with a calm that had taken her years to build, performing her work with the same quiet precision that had once baffled her teachers, and now earned her the respect of colleagues who valued results more than noise. And when he left, confident, oblivious, unaware that he had stood mere feet from the daughter he once deemed too much to handle, the air around her seemed to loosen, as though she had been holding her breath since childhood and had finally exhaled. But the real weight came later that evening, when she came home, placed her bag down, sat across from me at the kitchen table and whispered, "He did not see me." And in her voice I heard not sadness, but relief. She was not the frightened child he abandoned. She was a woman he could not diminish. The second escalation was not the return of the past. It was her realization that she no longer belonged to it. The day she told me she had been promoted, she stood in the doorway of the kitchen, with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Not in fear, but in a kind of fragile disbelief, as if her mind needed time to persuade her body that this moment belonged to her. She said it quietly, almost clinically, as though reporting a weather change. She would now be supervising a small team, coordinating projects, and reviewing incoming applicant files. The words drifted into the space between us, and for a few seconds I didn't fully grasp what she was telling me. Then the truth settled over me with a slow, warm weight. She had crossed a threshold, not only in her career, but in her sense of herself, and she was looking at me not for permission, but for acknowledgement. I stood up, went to her, and held her face in my hands, something I had not done since she was small. And I saw in her eyes the uneasy glow of a person stepping into a world they never believed they were allowed to enter. Her first week in the position was exhausting, not because of the work itself, but because of the abrupt shift in how people around her responded to her presence. Colleagues who once spoke over her now paused to listen, watching her with a carefulness she had never been afforded before. She told me she was learning how to read the subtle signals of authority, adjusting to the fact that her voice, once an afterthought, now carried weight. But beneath the surface of her new responsibilities, something deeper was brewing. She had access now to all candidate files for open roles within her department, including the one her father had applied for. At first, she didn't look. She avoided the system deliberately, focusing on onboarding her team, reorganizing processes, establishing a routine that would anchor her through the uncertainty. But avoidance cannot withstand proximity forever, and eventually she opened his file, printed it, and brought it home. She placed the folder on the table in front of me with the same delicacy she once used for fragile puzzles, and I understood that this was the moment she had been bracing for since she first saw his name. She didn't speak right away. She sat down, folded her hands, and stared at the folder, as though she could see through the paper into the years that had shaped her without him. When she finally began to talk, her voice was steady, but her breath trembled slightly at the edges. She told me she would be conducting the interview. Her supervisor had assigned it to her because she was best suited for evaluating the technical portion of the role. There was no malice in the assignment, no hidden intention, just the ordinary logic of a workplace unaware of the extraordinary history woven into this one decision. She said she had thought about declining, but she knew it would raise questions she didn't want to answer, and she didn't want her life to pivot around hiding from someone who had once considered her a burden. She said she wanted to face it. Not for revenge, not for closure. Simply to reclaim something she had lost before she was old enough to understand its absence. The night before the interview, we sat together on the couch in a silence that felt heavier than our usual quiet companionship. She leaned into my side, her head resting lightly against my shoulder, and I felt the small tremors of anticipation running through her like distant thunder. I stroked her hair the way I used to when she was small, and whispered that no outcome could lessen her. No reaction from him could undo the life she had built, and no recognition or lack of it would define her worth. She nodded, absorbing every word without comment, and I knew she was building internal scaffolding again, constructing a framework sturdy enough to hold her upright through whatever might come. The interview took place on a Wednesday morning. She left the house at her usual time, wearing a clean blouse and the soft gray blazer she reserved for occasions that demanded a precise blend of formality and comfort. I watched her walk to the bus stop with steady, measured steps, her posture tall but not rigid, her breath even, her hands relaxed at her sides. For the first time, I saw not the girl I had raised, but the woman she had become. A woman shaped by struggle and discipline, softened by empathy, sharpened by intellect, and anchored by a resolve she built without the help of the man she was about to face. She told me what happened only after she got home that evening. She didn't rush through the door or collapse into my arms. Instead, she set her bag down carefully, removed her blazer, hung it on the back of a chair, and sat across from me with her hands folded on the table. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she was still recalibrating her sense of gravity. Then she began to tell me everything, not dramatically, not tearfully, but with the clarity of someone describing an event that had already settled into its proper place in her memory. He hadn't recognized her. He walked into the room with a confident smile, extended his hand, and greeted her as he would greet any interviewer, with polite charm, practiced ease, and the faint desperation of a man trying to project stability. She didn't take his hand. Instead, she nodded and gestured for him to sit, explaining that the interview would be structured, timed, and focused on both technical and behavioral competencies. He didn't flinch at her tone. He didn't sense anything unusual in the room. She said he talked too much, embellished his experience, tried to mask gaps in his resume with vague explanations. She listened without reacting, asking follow-up questions, requesting specifics, guiding him back to clarity. She said there was a moment, just one, when he looked at her with a flicker of recognition, not of who she was, but of something familiar in her posture or eyes. But the flicker passed. He never connected her with the child he had left behind so many years ago. When the technical portion began, he struggled. He attempted to stretch limited knowledge into comprehensive answers, but she had spent her life learning to see the difference between substance and noise, between genuine competence and the kind of confident emptiness that people like him often wield like a shield. She evaluated him fairly, professionally, thoroughly. She didn't let emotion seep into her assessment. She simply measured what he offered and compared it to the standards of the role. The final question she asked was one she always asked candidates, but she told me she already knew he would answer it poorly. She asked him to describe a time he had taken responsibility for a failure. He paused for a long time, then spoke about a project that fell apart because of team issues, then about a supervisor who didn't communicate properly, then about circumstances that weren't manageable. Not once did he say, "I made a mistake." Not once did he say, "I could have done better." Not once did he recognize the pattern of his own life reflected in the words he chose. And in that moment, she said, she felt something unclench inside her, as though she had been bracing for impact, and suddenly realized there was nothing to brace against. When the interview ended, she thanked him formally and told him the team would follow up after reviewing all candidates. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and gave her a smile he probably believed was charming. She said there was no satisfaction in watching him walk away, no vindication, no triumph. Only a faint, unexpected tenderness for the child she had once been, the child who believed she wasn't worth staying for. Then she told me the sentence that marked the true turning point, the real climax of her long, painful journey. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I was just done. In her voice, I heard not bitterness, but release. She had become the woman he never imagined she could be, not because of his absence, but despite it. And in choosing to face him without seeking anything, no apology, no acknowledgement, no explanation, she had freed herself from the last thread tying her to a past she never chose. That night, after she went to bed, I stood in the kitchen alone, overwhelmed by the quiet magnitude of what had happened. She had confronted the man who once defined the limits of her life simply by refusing to love her, and she had walked away untouched. Not triumphant, not wounded, untouched. And I realized that for the first time in her life, the story she was living belonged entirely to her. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a gentler rhythm, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from acceptance, as though the air in the house had learned to breathe differently. She moved through her days with a quiet steadiness that felt new, not fragile, but rooted. The posture of someone who had walked through the remnants of an old wound and found it no longer capable of pulling her backward. She received the official confirmation from her company. Her father had not been selected for the position. The message was brief, bureaucratic, devoid of emotion, as detached as the voicemail her mother once left when surrendering responsibility for her. When she handed me the letter, she didn't linger on it or wait for my reaction. She simply placed it on the table and went to water the plants in the window, humming softly under her breath, a habit she had picked up in recent years when she felt grounded enough to let her voice exist in the world. I watched her from the kitchen doorway, taking in the simple grace of her movements, and I felt something inside me shift, not sharply, but with the gentle inevitability of a tide turning. For so long, I had been her anchor, her interpreter, her shield against a world that didn't know how to meet her where she stood. But she no longer needed me in the same way, not because she didn't love me, but because she had grown into herself without waiting for permission. And I found that the space she was stepping into made room for me to breathe differently too. It was the first time in many years that my life did not feel like a series of tasks, protections, calculations. Instead, it felt like a shared path where each of us could walk at our own pace without losing sight of the other. One evening, she came to sit beside me on the couch, carrying her laptop and a stack of notes. But instead of diving into her work the way she usually did, she closed the laptop and rested her head lightly on my shoulder. It was a gesture she hadn't made since her teenage years, and I felt the warmth of it settle through me with a tenderness I had not expected. She told me she was thinking about applying for a new certification, something more advanced, something that intimidated her but excited her too. She asked what I thought, and I laughed softly because she rarely sought opinions unless she already knew her own. I told her she should do it if it made her feel alive, if it made her feel like she was moving toward something instead of away from something. She nodded, and her fingers curled gently against my sleeve, a small, grounding gesture that reminded me of the little girl she once was, tapping the edge of the table before daring to sit. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the version of her father who might have existed if fear hadn't shaped him so profoundly, if he had learned to stay instead of run, if he had looked his daughter in the eye long enough to recognize her. I allow myself those thoughts only briefly, because they lead nowhere but sorrow. He called once after the interview process ended, leaving a message saying he had been in the area and wondered if he should stop by. The words were breezy, as though 20 years of absence could be folded neatly into one sentence. I didn't return the call, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say, nothing in me that still believed in the version of love he had always promised, but never delivered. The space he once occupied in our story had hardened into something like stone, present, but no longer shaping anything around it. The house feels different now, not quieter. She still hums when she cooks, still rearranges her workspace 3 times a week, still asks me questions in her soft, careful voice, but lighter, less burdened by the weight of old ghosts. Sometimes she brings me tea without being asked and sits at the table sorting through her emails, explaining bits of her work in that precise, measured way she uses when she is proud of something, but fears that pride might somehow be too loud. And I listen, absorbing every detail, not because I need to understand the technicalities, but because I want to witness the life she has carved out for herself with such meticulous determination. One night, as we folded laundry together, she paused with a towel in her hands and said very calmly, "I am not angry at him anymore." She didn't need to specify who she meant. The words floated into the room like a lantern finally being allowed to rise, and when she placed the towel on the pile, her hands no longer trembled. I reached toward her and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture from long ago that still felt natural, and told her that letting go didn't make the past disappear. It simply made space for something better. She nodded once, absorbing the thought without resistance, and I saw in her expression a quiet comprehension that had taken her years to reach. Now, when I look at her, I see not the girl who arrived at my door with a stuffed bear and a silence that felt impenetrable, but a woman who shaped her life through resilience, structure, and a tenderness she learned only because she had finally been given room to grow. And when I sit alone in the evenings, the soft lamp casting its familiar glow across the living room, I think of all the women who have taken in the children that others deemed too complicated, too sensitive, too demanding, and I hope they know that love given quietly is still a force powerful enough to rewrite the future. In the soft stillness of my later years, with my hands a little weaker and my steps a little slower, I find peace in knowing that I didn't save her. She saved herself. I was simply the one who stayed long enough for her to learn how to stand.